Well, thank you for coming to the, what number Lyceum is this? Does anybody know? It's been a while, since 1992. Somebody can do the math. We want to acknowledge the support of the College of Liberal Arts and Dean Lyons, as always. Keeps this show going. And we're happy to have Eric Thomas Weber here. He drove down from Lexington, right, to join us. Eric is an associate professor of educational policy studies and evaluation at the University of Kentucky, former professor of public policy leadership at the University of Mississippi, executive director and member of the board of trustees for the Society of Philosophers in America, SOPHIA, and is the author of 4 books, including Democracy and Leadership and Uniting Mississippi, and most recently has edited a volume of John Dewey's public writings titled America's Public Philosopher, Essays on Social Justice, Economics, Education, and the Future of Democracy, published with Columbia University Press 2021. Dr. Weber earned his PhD in philosophy in 2007 at Southern Illinois University, his master's in philosophy from Ohio University, and his BS in philosophy and communication studies from Vanderbilt. His latest book, A Culture of Justice, is under review, and he's in the early stages of developing his next book on the importance of and conflicts concerning freedom in education, our very topic here this afternoon. He also chaired the Society for the Advancement of American Philosophy's Committee on Public Philosophy and co-hosted the podcast Philosophy Bakes Bread. And I particularly recommend checking the archives for episode 5, John Locke's on Stoic Pragmatism. We lost John Locke this week. He was my mentor. He was your mentor. He was a prince. And that episode was about how to balance the need to cope with our limitations in life while nevertheless making some progress every week or every day in ways large and small. Got that from the Philosophy Bakes Bread website. Eric's continuing commitment to public-facing philosophy makes him an obvious, and I'm sure we'll agree, an excellent choice for our Applied Philosophy Lyceum, which has been stimulating private reflection and public reasoning on matters of human practice from our website since 1992. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Eric Thomas Weber.
Let's see if I can do this. All right. Hello. I think if I don't put this in my pocket, there's going to be a disaster. Okay. I need to check one thing to make sure this is working. There we go. Okay. Thank you all for having me, so much for having me. I am going to talk today about, as you heard, a contemporary and challenging issue in the public sphere. I've worked in researching and teaching about public policy since the beginning, but I'm a philosophical pragmatist. I'm someone who's interested in political philosophy and ethics, and I'm a big fan of John Dewey's philosophy, who was obviously an enormous influence in terms of thought about democracy and education. So when I moved to the state of Mississippi and I found such deep problems in both of those things, I focused significantly and was really passionate and interested in those subject matters, which have continued to today. And when I moved to the University of Kentucky, I spent 2 years in the philosophy department before ultimately settling in the Department of Educational Policy Studies and Evaluation, where I'm the resident philosopher. So I'm in the College of Education, and I take it that for what I do, it's a good sign when people in other departments value the contributions of philosophy. So I think that's a good thing. At the same time, I do want to say I love all kinds of philosophy, including, abstract matters or thinking about Zeno's paradox. I really enjoyed the book If P Then Q. It's not really a public-facing book. That's okay, though. Philosophy can be of all kinds, but we do need some philosophers to really help call attention to the public value of philosophy, or else we lose support. And it's something we got to be aware of, as many of us know well, all too well, unfortunately. Today's talk, I've only got the very simplest of PowerPoints. I wasn't going to use a PowerPoint, but I've got a number of steps. So I figure at least having the outline in front of us would be useful. And my next slide is just this, where you won't see them all at the same time. So a very simple PowerPoint is not much. But that said, the first thing I want to do is to thank you all for inviting me here and for coming tonight. This is a wonderful turnout, and I'm thrilled about it. And in addition, in particular, I want to thank Phil Thank you so much for having me and for thinking about having me come here. It's a great opportunity. Phil and I saw each other last at the annual conference, or one of the recent times we've seen each other is the annual conference, or not the annual conference, the first conference in honor of John Locke at Vanderbilt University. And he's this happy fella over here. John Locke was a tremendous mentor. He was easily one of my very best friends. I studied with him for the first time as a freshman somewhere around there, around 1998. And he's been my teacher, friend, and mentor ever since. And when you can have such a relationship with a professor, you can't be luckier. You know, I feel at every stage of the decisions I had to make where there were tough choices to make, he helped me see the silver lining or the happier way to think about something that sucks, you know, and he had tremendous advice at every stage, and I wanted to be him from the earliest days because he seemed so happy and he was this great philosopher, and I loved all that. So thanks to Phil, thanks to the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies, thanks to you all for coming, thanks so much for the coordination from Heather Gibbs and of the Philosophy and Religion Department as well. Thank you so much. And also, although he can't hear it, unless you think in other ways perhaps, thank you to John for being such an inspiration for me. At the Vanderbilt conference, I bring him up not just because he's just recently passed away, but before he passed away, there was this opportunity to honor him and talk about his work. There are a couple of themes that are very important in his work that were influential for me. He held certain kinds of points of view which weren't the same as mine, but boy was he an inspiration, and he was always a supporter and encourager of others, even if they were very different from his point of view. And that was wonderful from him. He would not label himself because he said, as soon as you label yourself, people stop listening. He's a big advocate for liberty, though. You know, he would not probably choose the term libertarian, but a lot of people might think of him as one. But he was a complex thinker who was more than a simple label. But one of the reasons why he valued liberty is because he also valued profoundly the variety and plurality of the ways in which human beings can be happy and flourish. It's amazing how different people can be and how differently people can find ways to be happy in meaningful ways that don't hurt others. And that, I think, is actually something very useful for our talk today, right? Where we're going to talk about ways in which some people want to severely limit the potential for people to explore what might make them happy. So at the conference, was this in October 22? Goodness, not that long ago. I had occasion to think about that. And at the time, there were all these things happening in education and the bills and these problems. And so I thought, my goodness, I had finished a book I'd worked on for a decade. It's now an initial contract, I'm happy to say, since we last talked. But I was wanting to move on for the next thing, and it seemed to me that so many people are talking about, parents' freedom, all these issues about education. Well, what about generally speaking, thinking about freedom in education? And so that's what I talked about at the conference, because John was such an advocate for liberty. So in doing so, I wanted to think about all these conflicts, and I launched sort of the big picture ideas. I have an overarching essay about what I think will be my next book. And this essay today is in particular to talk about the problems in particular that stem from the Florida bill called the Parental Rights in Education Bill. Some people have dubbed it the Don't Say Gay Bill. Of course, that's a rhetorical term, but so many of those are useful and sometimes spot on, sometimes less so. But we want to be fair, and we want to think about convincing people different from us. Why do philosophy? Well, if you only talk to people who think like you, it doesn't do a whole lot of good. Well, it does less good anyway than if you can actually convince other people. And to convince other people, you have to think about their values and really try your best to appreciate and understand why they think what they think, such that you might actually appeal to them, to perhaps change their minds. So I'm going to do my best to understand alternate outlooks on a subject matter for which I nevertheless have a pretty strong concern and set of critiques. But if anyone has ideas about things I've omitted, I've just begun this project. I've given a lot of talks about things that I've finished, but this is not one of those. This is early. So I want your critiques. I want your, hey, but you didn't think about this. Tell me that. I welcome that. And I love critical feedback. I think philosophy is only improved by that. So the aims for today, I'm going to read a couple of words. I wanted to say one more thing in the thank yous, which is that it's an honor to speak in the Lyceum, this applied philosophy Lyceum. I think it's one of those things related to what I said about the value of doing philosophy for public relevance. It's part of what we need to do in order to be seen, in order to be appreciated for what philosophers contribute, though it's by no means a say that other kinds of philosophy are any less important. I think that's really vital. A lot of colleagues worry, oh, not everybody needs to do public philosophy. I agree. I agree completely. Nevertheless, we need some folks to do it and to be advocates. Okay, so today's aim, again, essentially to consider the various reasons for and against Florida's Parental Rights in Education Act, inspiring bills around the country right now in the federal government, in the context of the meaning and import of freedom in education philosophically examined. That's essentially my aim. I was just speaking with one of y'all about the idea that, you know, America is this laboratory of the states, as we say. And yet what's happening lately is that people get an idea, they pass a bill in one place, they have no idea what it's going to do, and then they try and pass it everywhere. It's the strangest phenomenon. How about we try something in a place and see how it goes? Right? And that's not what people are doing. So perhaps we should be more conservative and slow down. We can say to some of the conservative friends who value conservatism, hey, let's be slow and cautious here. These are our kids' lives at stake. All right, so I've explained the origins, I think, already of this project. So if you haven't read the abstract, this is, I think, useful to frame what we're doing, because I'm going to go through a bunch of facts, but I want them to be anchored in what the purpose is. So one more thing I'll read, and then I'll try to stop reading. So parents and guardians are naturally concerned about what their children are taught in schools. Obviously, our kids are some of the most important things in our lives, if not the most. Some lament what they feel is a lack of control over curricula and what are thought to be forces or agendas that they believe are not in kids' interests. The arguments presented in recent conflicts take two main forms. Surely you could say there are other forms, and if you think others are more important, I'd be delighted to hear about it. The first, advanced in similar fashion on opposing sides of the issues concerning gender and early education, takes the form of the arguments to protect children, quote unquote. The second, typically arising in discourse about desire for exclusion or selection of curricular content or messages, typically focuses on parents' rights, they call it, in particular to freedom of choice, whether that regard selection of schools, banning of books, inclusion or exclusion of desired or undesired subject matters. So I'm going to defend something a little different, though, the importance of students and teachers' freedom, and challenge the overreach of dominant parental views that seek to silence the lived experiences and concerns of marginalized groups. It's not that I don't think parents should have rights or freedoms protected, but we also can go too far. So I'm in a college of education, as you heard, and my colleagues have created a remarkable program of research methods. It's kind of like what some people refer to negatively, though I don't necessarily share this concern, as the epistemology industry. Some of my friends have called trends in some fields, or in some departments there's this logic set of courses that are how you make your bread and butter, and I don't know if there's anything wrong with that. The point is, though, that when graduate students in the College of Ed think about a dissertation, well, they get asked, what methods are you going to use? Are you a qualitative or a quantitative researcher? Well, what if they're doing a philosophy project? How do you answer that? I guess some people want to say it's qualitative, but when you look at what qualitative research methods are, they're empirical. I'm an empiricist, but that doesn't mean I gather data. Well, I gather research, right? I gather data in a sense, I suppose, but I think about reasons and so forth. My point is that graduate students need guidance on how to explain to my colleagues what the heck they do when they work with me. So, after getting tenure again after a move to this new institution, I finally sort of made my case. There needs to be a philosophical research methods course, and I'm teaching one right now. It's really fun, and there aren't very many of these courses taught in the world. Look for it. It's very few. It's weird. But philosophers don't really express what their methods are for doing their research. We do tend to articulate super clearly what our reasoning is or why we think what we're thinking. That's all very good, and maybe that's enough. And one way of thinking about it is to say that philosophers' research methods are through writing, conferral. We go to conferences to confer. My colleagues go to conferences to disseminate. It's a very different attitude. Not that there's anything wrong with that. So, that said, in my course, one of the many methods we talk about, and you've heard me say I like Dewey, is Dewey's method, which is one I derive from a chapter in his book, Logic, the Theory of Inquiry. And the chapter is called The Pattern of Inquiry. And so it has a number of steps. I'm going to jump through these quickly to explain what I'm doing, and then I'll go back one by one to follow that procedure. First of all, when you want to study something, there is an environment in which whatever that is occurs, is found, develops, what have you. In a Hegelian fashion, Dewey sort of says there's this inchoate whole out of which we carve and make distinctions, right? But the prior reality isn't already so distinguished. It's an indeterminate situation, he says, right? So you want to think about the antecedent conditions in which we say problems arise. We also, by the way, don't want to assume that when people tell me, here's this problem, we don't necessarily want to accept the characterization of a problem someone brings us. So we want to think about this because they may have a troubling agenda behind that characterization of the problem, right? So at the same time, there's this institution of a problem in that context. Then there's sort of a determination of a problem solution. What does that mean? Dewey would say, a problem well put is half solved. When you put a problem well, possible solutions suggest themselves to you. But as I've seen with countless graduate students, lots of problems are very hard to put well. that's the first and grandest challenge generally. You hear people fumbling around about, I'm working on blah, 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 and what is all this? Well, eventually we have a process which goes from an inchoate mess to something fairly fine and clear. And so that's what we want to do when we do inquiry. We want to determine a problem solution, and then reason through the considerations relevant before we then think about how to operationalize the characteristics of the facts and meanings we determine. Finally, we got to think about what sorts of evidence we can draw on. Do we have science about these things? And if not, we have to use common sense. And if we have science, well, we also want to just not blindly assume that something is well understood. Nevertheless, we often have very good science about some things, and we should consider drawing on those as important sources of evidence. So that's what I'm going to talk through today with respect to the Florida Bill, Parental Rights in Education. So, at the same time, when we're talking about this inchoate, indeterminate situation, well, there's a million things you could mention as in the context. So I will bring up a number of facts and considerations in the context, in the background of thinking about the development of this Parental Rights in Education Act. We say bill all the time, but that's until it passes, right? Until it's signed. And now it's an act. So, if I've excluded things, which is very likely, that you think are important, you will help me considerably by mentioning them, telling me what am I leaving out, right? Again, this is a work in progress. This is not something I've finished. It's very different to give those two different kinds of talks. You've ironed out a lot of things usually once you've already published something. So this is in progress. So I'm going to go through a number of the considerations that I've been thinking about, and I invite your thoughts about what else. But antecedent conditions in thinking about where we are now to try and characterize aspects of our present problem situation include the following. In 2023, there is a national survey on the mental health of LGBTQ young people. 41% of LGBTQ youth consider seriously attempting suicide the past year. 41%. Nearly 2 in 3 LGBTQ youth said potential state or local laws banning discussion of LGBTQ issues at school made their mental health worse. Parents, the American Pediatric Association, which has 64,000 members who are doctors, and the American Psychological Association, I don't know their number of membership, it's big, call efforts to combat to combat LGBTQ identity harmful, detrimental. With efforts to explore gender identity, with efforts to try and support youth so that they don't feel these kinds of anxieties, depression, suicidal ideations, right? People try to, and pediatricians recommend, hey, be tolerant, understanding. If you create an environment in which people are accepting or at least open, the mental health effects are severely, that's not the right word, are significantly diminished, right? To the point where you don't have such terrible effects. People said for a long time in the debates about same-sex marriage, and which are sort of precursors to certain elements of parental rights, that, when people, are same-sex oriented, they'll be more depressed and so on. Well, it depends on the environment in which they find themselves, right? You can make it worse for people, or you can make it easier for people to live when, they're singled out and marginalized, right? Teachers and caregivers, including doctors, worry about mental health. And I mentioned suicides, obviously. But also think about that 6-year-old who is confused because she doesn't like the things that her friends like. Right? She feels different about a number of things and doesn't understand what's going on. Can she talk to a teacher about that? Right? Maybe it's hard to talk to your parents sometimes. Sometimes when you bring up such things with parents, you can have pretty negative situations or interactions. Sex education regulations have spread significantly also. When I lived in Mississippi at the time when I moved there didn't require sex education. In 2010, they passed a bill requiring all districts to have some form of sex education, which was either abstinence only or abstinence plus. And it was a decision. But anyway, the point is that we didn't even have that until 2010 in Mississippi. But the conveying of sex education is now pretty universal. And the question is, at what age do you begin? And some people are really concerned. This is part of the background consideration. Some people are really concerned about education about that for young kids. Oh, that's not age appropriate, we might say, right? There are a lot of ways to do these things. The very question of what is age appropriate is a difficult matter to make sense of. I've been trying to find how people determine what is and what is not age appropriate. And you might say, well, you don't want kids to do certain things until later ages, and if you talk about it, that'll inspire them to do it. The problem with all that is the language about sex education was ignoring the fact that when you teach it, kids were already having sex years before in a lot of places. So you got to worry about these things, as well as the fact that some kids are abused. And you can sort of work on, diminishing that or alleviating, or not on alleviating, but combating that. But kids have to know about what's not appropriate. They have to know some things. And how do you teach a kindergartner? Some people want kindergarten to teach sex education. Oh my gosh, that sounds crazy, right? Well, how about you teach about consent? Right? And how do people teach consent to kindergartners about sex? Well, you don't necessarily talk about sex. You talk about what consent is. For instance, the hula hoop lesson. You don't get in someone's hula hoop without permission. Right? There's a certain space around you. Right? You can teach them with hula hoops. I remember when I was a kid pulling people's hair and that kind of stuff. I know it's terrible. I apologize in retrospect. I was stupid and kid. Not taught these things, by the way. We need to teach people these things, that you don't get in someone's physical space. You don't touch them without their consent. And I've been working with my kids about, hey, you don't touch without permission, so forth. And so is that sex education? Absolutely. If a kid might be touched and you want them to know, hey, you're not supposed to touch me without my permission, right? I think that would be a valuable lesson. These are things in the background of our discussions. Parents are uncomfortable, though. When you start to talk about these things and you start to be affirming and so on, there are parents who are uncomfortable about, wait, why are you talking about wanting to wear a dress, Timmy? Right? Well, my teacher said, and then parents get very upset. Because the kids, they think the kids are confused. That this is weird, that you're sort of getting kids into situations in which they'll be bullied, is the thought, among other things. In the background, there's also issues of there being transgender athletes, right? Where you might have a daughter who's really good at swimming, and she says she wants to get a scholarship to go swim in college. And there's a transgender athlete on the team who's winning all the time and has considerably more testosterone, right? And people get upset. They want to win. They want to be the one to get the scholarship, right? And people feel strange about these things. And part of that, of course, is that we have in our culture a form of continuing segregation on the basis of sports. Is it a bad thing? I don't know what to say about it yet. I've got to keep thinking about how we can think about this matter. But we have traditions that are rooted in a past in which people didn't affirm or respect or support certain kinds of identities or behaviors. And we have remnants of that that seemed unproblematic until they become problematic or become more clearly so, right? And then there's people who are born female who have a lot of testosterone, right? Castor Semenya. I don't know if you've heard of Castor Semenya. Anyway, so these are matters in the background for us to think about and keep in mind and consider. Parents want powers to challenge schools, and they want choices. And we understand that. We like the million tomato sauces we have at the store. We like to be able to choose what we want. And John Locke's a big advocate for liberty and a big advocate for diversity, also wrote a book called On Meddling. He loves liberty, but he also is concerned about how much people meddle in each other's lives, which is, again, related to the issue of liberty. He thinks we should minimize, diminish, avoid meddling in other people's lives. If you want people to be happy, let them be happy. Get out of their way, right? But when you're dealing with public schools, how do you avoid meddling? Anything you advocate for your kid can sometimes, or not anything, many things you might advocate regarding your kids could be things which then have, of course, effects on other kids, right? So these are all matters in the background of the antecedent conditions of the indeterminate situation that some people are trying to figure out what the heck to do about. What should we say about these things? They want powers to control. They want efficacy. They just feel frustrated, many parents, right? They want to figure out what they can do. Let me give you two more points of data to consider in the background. In Florida, the poverty line for families of 4 is $30,000. Average starting teacher salaries in the state of Florida are $40,000. Consider, you might think, oh, well, that's $10,000 more. Before taxes, though, right? You know, and before whatever else has to come out. So, yes, we're talking about a couple, maybe $500, $600 more a month than people living in poverty. If that sounds like a lot to you, well, it doesn't to me. So maybe convince me that sounds reasonable. Why do I bring up the poverty line and teachers' pay? Because we have an unbelievable teacher shortage. It's a problem. We're struggling deeply to get teachers. Why are we struggling to get teachers? Well, a lot of reasons. One of them, of course, is pay. But most teachers, when you ask them about whether they'd choose this or more pay, usually choose the thing that will make their working conditions more meaningful and rewarding. In fact, I don't have it with me, but Diane Ravitch, a great scholar of education and its history, and a former member of the U.S. Department of Education under 2 different administrations, Republican and Democrat, she made clear from from a book called Reign of Error that's what teachers have preferred in surveys. And so experiments to pay teachers a whole lot more have usually not yielded great results, although should we pay teachers more? Yes, they should be making considerably more than the poverty line as professionals taking care of our children. And not just taking care of them, but helping them to pursue their lives in meaning and happiness. Okay, so there's an incredible teacher shortage. This is relevant in the background. So if you're going to pay teachers less, what do they need? Well, at least job security, for goodness sake. Well, that's one of the things being threatened right now, right? Okay, these are a number of the matters in the background. I've got a lot of other things to bring up, and I'm sure I've excluded many considerations, and if you have important ones I should consider, please bring them up for me. But essentially, you could come up with an awful lot of considerations in the background concerning antecedent conditions for thinking about the Parental Rights in Education Act. So, what do we say about the institution of a problem? Look, 90% of kids in the United States are educated in public schools. Okay, it might be 89%, but it's almost 90%. There are people who think one solution would be privatization, having private schools. Okay? I had a student argue this in a paper the other day, which he submitted to this government employee at the University of Kentucky when he could have gone to Transylvania State University across the street in Lexington. Why do people think that we can have private schools do better on such little money? What vouchers and so forth will help a few people who can already afford, mostly. Some can't afford it and it'll help them, but the vast majority of Americans, it was from the Brookings Institution, they found 44% of Americans work in low-wage jobs in which those full-time earn $24,000 a year. 44% of Americans. So when you're talking about enormous numbers of people, even if you could make a bunch of privates for the wealthier, well, you're going to even have a deeper caste system in this country than we have now, right? And how are the poor going to get an education? Let alone, by the way, no private school has to accept to educate my very disabled daughter. And it costs more to educate her. So when you take money out of schools, you don't just give money to a family to pay for their kids, you also diminish the buying power of economies of scale for the public schools, right? Which threatens the education of my daughter, who won't be taken by she's nonverbal, she doesn't walk, she's fed through a tube. But she learns. And it's moving to me, the team of people in public schools who are amazing and coordinate incredible specialties of 12 people around a table in a room who care about her. I'm so moved by that. So 90% of kids are educated in public schools in America. And we have this problem where if we have a problem and we're concerned, we don't want to be voiceless or powerless. I get it. And at the same time, when we engage in discourse like that, we often end up meddling in other people's lives, sort of inevitably almost, right? As Howard Zinn famously would say, you can't be neutral on a moving train. So in this context, some people who are very upset about what their kids come home saying and thinking, right? People who value tradition, right? There's a reason we have traditions. Things tend to work better as a result of traditions, at least many of them. So when people see threats to deep-seated important traditions, they're worried. They think this is the end times. Or at least that their kids' lives are going to be worse than theirs. And that's the opposite of what most Americans used to say. It was a sort of an ideal. You want your kids' lives to be better than yours. Let me tell you, that's a tough one when your kid is born and has a stroke on her first day of life, as my daughter did. So in that context, you get the Parents' Rights in Education Act. Of course, it was a bill first, right? And Governor Ron DeSantis is concerned about angry parents who, want to deal with folks who are, making their kids have greater anxiety. They don't understand how to talk to folks. They don't understand what words to use. They don't understand, what they're feeling, right? Their friends are embracing things. They get it. They try. They come home, and their parents get mad at them, maybe, or a friend does, or what have you, or they get bullied. And the parents are mad then. And where are you getting this? Oh, school. Okay, so we get the Parents' Rights in Education Act. DeSantis says that education for children about gender identity is, quote, trying to sow doubt in kids about their gender identity. And that such education, quote, is trying to say that they can be whatever they want to be. I thought that's what we were supposed to tell our kids, but that's just me. DeSantis' former press secretary argued that people are, quote, grooming 4 to 8-year-old children, I guess presumably to be members of the LGBTQ community. That's, the quote was grooming 4 to 8-year-old children. Usually you say grooming towards some end, but I think we have to assume, I guess, or maybe ask the question. So what explicitly does this bill, by the way, it's 7 pages, double-spaced, big font. You can read it if you want. And it's broad as hell, which means the courts are going to strike it down eventually. Usually it's just so easily over applied. So it's probably going to fail soon enough, but who knows, man? These are weird times. What does it say? Okay, that says a number of things, but the key that I'm concerned about, and I'm here about, I think that lots of people have been most concerned about, right, is that it prohibits schools from, quote, having classroom discussions or, quote, giving classroom instruction about sexual orientation or gender identity from K through 3rd grade. If you said K through 12th grade, well, actually, you would please Democrat Tulsi Gabbard. Or Gifford? I have it on the next page. I said it wrong, didn't I? Is it Gifford? Yeah. Gabbard, right? I don't know why I'm okay. From Arizona, right? Hawaii. Oh Lord, where is she from? Hawaii. Gabby Gifford from Arizona. Oh Lord, hold on. I'll get it right. Tulsi Gabbard. I'm sorry, Democrat Tulsi Gabbard. I'm sorry. No longer in office, but that person thought we should protect kids, quote unquote, protect kids through 12th grade. She thought the mistake was, not being expensive enough. I apologize. I had COVID a couple weeks ago, and they talk about a brain fog. I think for the most part I'm okay, but every now and then I don't know, I'm thrown off a little bit, or I just stumbled, whatever. So what else does it say? In addition to those things about 3rd grade, so at least it is limited to K through 3, right? And when you think about why, well, it seems less controversial to say, hey, maybe we don't need to be talking with kindergartners about sex. I mean, on the surface of it, okay, we're not going to do a condom demonstration with kindergartners, right? I don't think that's controversial, although if you wanted to do one, it doesn't bother me. But nevertheless, I can imagine people being very upset about condom demonstrations for kindergartners, right? Some people would think that's very inappropriate. I think people who would think that's inappropriate, at least. Well, listen, here's the kicker. If a parent is upset about what a school's doing, okay, the school district is supposed to pay the legal costs for the parent. It would cost you nothing to sue a school district. That one blew me away. Every Republican I've ever met in the last 20 years has been in favor of tort reform because there's too many frivolous lawsuits. And lots of my students have done projects on this regarding hospital lawsuits, and we need to control tort. Well, you just made it free to sue school districts that they have a lot of money, right? So I'm amazed by this. Bills around the country, furthermore, and in the federal government, are presently under consideration to replicate these rules. Advocates against the bill include students especially, right? Young people are pretty vehemently against this, among other limitations, things like book bans, but I'm focused on this particular bill. Older populations are considerably more in support. Human rights groups, advocacy organizations, over 300 businesses in Florida, or that work in Florida as well, including Disney, Apple, NBC, ABC, CBS, Google, Shell, GM, Toyota, Wells Fargo, American Airlines, CVS, and many more, oppose this act. The National Educational Association calls it, quote, deeply disturbing legislation that aims to censor educators. The American Academy of Pediatrics calls the legislation harmful to children. And here's the interesting thing. People think, well, but it's popular. Well, if you actually look at the polls, you might find differently. The University of Florida poll of Florida voters found 49% oppose the act and 40% support it. Siena College's poll of Florida voters found 50% oppose, 44% support. And the Ipsos poll of Americans found that 62% oppose it and 37% support. Now, if something were popular, does that mean thereby it's okay? No, it's not enough. Nevertheless, if you say, well, but it's what people want, you might say it's democratic because it's the will of the people. Sure, but if the will of the people wishes to silence someone's free speech, too bad. We have a Bill of Rights for a reason. Democracy is both popular, will, choice, what have you, but also the protection of minority rights. Not just minority, but obviously the will of the majority can trample the rights of the minority, whatever minority we're talking about. So These are considerations of the institution of the problem. There has been this effort to deal with anger, and it's taken the form of a bill that became an act that's going all over the country, and people are deeply worried. Think about this question. If you were a school principal and a parent threatened to sue, right? Would you brush it off? Or would that be a worry when you're on the hook in your district to pay for this legal fee? The very idea of a threat can be chilling, right? So you've got this excited teacher who just graduated and really wants to help kids, and the kid comes up and says, you know, my mommy and daddy don't understand why Timmy's got two daddies, right? And what are you supposed to say to that? Well, the excited parent wants to sort of be encouraging and, teacher. Well, what is the administrator going to say to that teacher? Right? Kids bring questions. They bring lives. We have families of all kinds. This isn't something you can just bury your head in the sand about. And kids don't shut up, by the way. I mean, if you have any, you know what I'm talking about. All right. So this part is brief because there's a number of ways in which people can deal with the kinds of situation we have, right? The backlash has been substantial, but the bill is one approach that people have proposed as a way to address what they take the problem to be. And this is part of the issue when you're dealing with social problems, that different people conceive of the problem differently, right? At the same time, look, in public philosophy, if you want to convince people of something, think about the sources and the values that they care about, that they respect, okay? And what I mean by that is, if you're a conservative, presumably, if you're told about it, you think, yeah, F.A. Hayek, Friedrich Hayek, yeah, he's cool, right? I like Hayek, for instance. What does Hayek say about policy? Right? He says that most policies do more harm than good, right? Most efforts, right, when you try to alleviate a problem, cause more problems than they resolve. That's why he's that form of conservative, right? He's an intellectual, philosophical conservative. I'm not trying to tell you to be Hayek or fans of Hayek, but if you want to talk to a conservative, read some conservatives, and then think about, hey, well, you know, is this important to you? Is this important to you? Well, then maybe you want to think differently about that, so forth. Okay, so this was one approach people have proposed, is this notion that we can resolve it with the bill, this inchoate mass of considerations. Others see a reversal of this bill, rejecting it as a solution. But you're also still going to have upset parents trying to advance whatever initiative they can to sort of, you know, combat the problem that they see. Yet another option is to think about the following. If the issue is that talking to kids about certain things in certain ways is age inappropriate, how about we think about what it might mean to be age appropriate and talk about things in different ways? Part of our issue is we don't really know yet how to talk about some things well, or I don't, maybe, many other people might. Well, we need to hear from these folks, and we need to bring them into discussions about how to write textbooks, how to talk to teachers. Every summer, we have trainings for professional development for teachers, right? So it's not like it's going to cost a lot of money to have to train people on new things. We do it every summer. So make next summer thinking about how to talk about gender, right? Of course, it'll be controversial what some people propose, but I haven't heard anyone think the hula hoop lesson is inappropriate for kindergartners. And yet, is that an important insight that has to do with potential sexual activity? Hells yes, I want my kids to learn that. I tell them that. I teach my son, of course, at one point I'd probably say, you don't just touch girls without but anybody. It's not, right? I just have a memory of me being a bad kid and I pulled a girl's ponytail and I feel terrible about it, but, Okay, so one way would be to think about envisioning new forms of age appropriateness. And yet another, I don't know how desirable this is. It doesn't make me the most comfortable, and yet it can be a way of resolving political conflicts, is to give options. So what do I mean by that? I mentioned the sex education bill in Mississippi, right? What they did is they made it such that school districts could choose either to be abstinence only or abstinence plus. They had to pick one as a district. And then in the districts in which abstinence plus was used, parents could opt out. So if you don't like it, you don't have to have it. But guess what? If you're in a district that chooses abstinence only, you can't get the plus. So I was an advocate in Mississippi for saying that's stupid. Go the other way. Say abstinence plus and give people a chance to opt out if you want. Okay? That's not what I would do, but like if it's a resolution of the conflict at least. And instead they chose the opposite, which means some people won't be able to get for their kids the education that they want. And overwhelmingly, this is the weird thing, overwhelmingly in the polls, Mississippians want comprehensive sex education for their kids. I can prove it. We've got great surveys. 3,000 people were surveyed. To judge Americans, we were 300 million. We poll what, 1,000 people? And that's substantial, right? For 3 million Mississippians, 100 times less. They polled 3,000 people and found overwhelmingly that they wanted sex education for the kids. Why? It's one of the states with the highest unintended pregnancy rates, right? Of course they want sex education taught, but the politicians, a few, the minority who are really vocal and advocating, they won't sign on your bill unless you support this. They're powerful, unfortunately, and they sometimes choose stupider bills. But my point is that you could make options for certain kinds of opting out for some kids, but the kids who need this is a different matter. Of course, what's left out there is the kid who then, has parents who don't want them to be talking about this, but needs to talk about it. And so this is yet another reason why I'm concerned about this act, right? There are ways to modify things if you focus on what the problem is, and this is one of those problems, right? And there's a lot of problems we could talk about, but I'm sort of, again, this is an early stage of a new project for me, and I'm thinking through aspects of different parts of an overarching problem for which we presently have what I think is a very damaging proposed solution. Okay, so then what can philosophers offer about all this? Well, what we're famous for is, among other things, is reasoning, right? So how do we think about this? Well, we think through the kinds of arguments people give, okay? So one of the things that comes up frequently in defense of the Parental Rights and Education Act is the notion of wanting to protect children. But the very context in which all this arose when we began was the notion that kids are already dying. Suicides, right? Or having suicidal ideation. My own concern is that we only seem to care about mental health when there's suicidal ideation or suicides. How about thinking about concern for it earlier than that? That said, protecting children is exactly why we're introducing respect for kids' consideration of different options, of ways of thinking about their lives. Will kids potentially have some anxiety when they don't know what to think and their friend is behaving differently than he, she, they used to, and you're upset because your parents don't think that's right, and you are learning from your parents, and so okay, so there's some tumult in kids' lives. Okay, but there's that and there's suicide. Okay? So some anxiety, sure, is important, and we should care about some anxiety, but there's also smart ways to talk with people about this. And where does the anxiety especially get aggravated? Home lives that don't tolerate. At the same time, yes, there's bullying, but a cause about bullying can be campaigns against it. In fact, I remember tons of bullying when I was a kid, and there's such a culture of resisting that today that I'm so glad to see. I was terrified when I was a kid of the really big kids who would come at me, and I thought I was really going to get hurt, and sometimes I was. So there's smarter things. We have anti-bullying campaigns, but we can do more. More salient protection, for protection is a consideration of what forms of harm. And when you're philosophers, you think about kind of what are the principles involved. And if you're thinking about sort of incentives and what sorts of things affect people, Robert Nozick would talk about like, if you wanted to diminish a practice, well, think about how severe the punishment is going to be and how likely you are to be caught. Right? Those are the two main considerations Nozick brings up in Anarchy, State, and Utopia. Well, you can apply that in this kind of case in a slightly different way. You could say, well, when we're considering the harms going on or the dangers going on, how severe are the harms and how likely are these things to happen? Okay? And so for a lot of people to have a little bit of anxiety versus, 41% of LGBTQ youth thinking about suicide in the past year, I think the scales are heavily leaning in a direction, and not by partisanship. Maybe parties consider this differently, but you don't have to be in a given party to think, oh my gosh, this is very unequal kinds of weights and concerns. And you also have to think about the cost of the solution, and I don't only mean financial, right? There are moral and educational costs of certain policies that we need to consider. So what might we say about those? We should ask our friends concerned, what is the harm of kids experimenting with thoughts about gender identity? Anxiety. There's probably some anxiety. If you have more thoughts for me, I really want to do my best to respect and consider other people. I wrote for the newspaper for almost a decade in Mississippi and got a really lot of good responses. I was in a public policy program at the flagship, so a lot of my students, knew the governor and they said he'd read my newspaper article. I'm like, oh, that's cool. I just, I hope it sinks in. But that's another matter. My point is that you can appeal to people even when, you differ from a lot of their points of view. I don't particularly think the Confederate flag is something to be proud of, for instance, right? And I advocated hard for changing that damn flag among other people, lots of other people, including so many students. And now they said they'd never change the flag. They've got a new flag, right? Some will say then, well, it's only a flag. It's only symbolic. What you value and prize in the public square matters. Okay, so yes, anxiety, persons who grow up, and I've already mentioned this, that, what are some of the harms? Well, especially if you're worried about those harms, if you're worried about anxiety, think about how you talk in your family with your kids. Think about how you treat them. Think about, ways you can diminish that anxiety. And some of those might mean then that what we need is somehow more engagement with parents to work on these kinds of things with them, to acknowledge their concern about their kids' anxieties, right? Here are things we've found, and research has begun finding useful guides for us. Okay, so what are the costs of proposals and policies? Well, I mentioned in the beginning, in terms of the context, teacher shortages. When I talk about this stuff in classes and conferences, the downside is my students say, I'm not so sure I want to go into education. And I say, I can appreciate that. I'm sorry. If you go into it, you need to go into it with informed consent, however. So I don't think I'm doing the wrong thing when I talk about this stuff with students in a college of education. I think I'm doing something important for them, because if they don't think they'll be able to handle that, we'll have another person teach for 2 years and then leave the profession, which is already what's happening in huge supply, right? As I mentioned, the very possibility of a threat for a district that doesn't have the money to fix the leaky roof, because every month they just have enough to pay salaries, right? The very possibility of having to pay someone else's legal bill to get sued would have what effect on your decision? Imagine you're a principal. What would you say to a teacher when a kid comes up to that teacher and the teacher wants to talk to you, principal, about how do I talk to this kid? He's telling me this and that about their family arrangement, and he feels weird and he doesn't think he can talk to his parents, but he's really sad and thinking of hurting himself. As the principal, what would you say to the teacher? Think about it. What are you going to cut to pay the legal bill to sue you? A bus route? It's probably not enough. As I mentioned, most Republicans favor tax reform. Why? Because frivolous lawsuits make our medical situation incredibly expensive. Now, hospitals have oodles of money by contrast. Well, at least there's oodles of money in the medical industry, right? And so people smell that and they want some, and they sue and they sue and they sue. And lots of people want to in conservative form and fashion, worry about our healthcare expenses, lower these costs, make healthcare more accessible. There are moderate, reasonable Republican arguments for tort reform, and this is blowing open the option to have our school districts be sued, right? Tax dollars are going to have to pay for these lawsuits, and we're either going to have to pay more or we're going to have to cut further the education of our kids. And if your kids aren't in the public schools, as 10%, roughly 10% aren't, maybe you're not so concerned about that. But I think we should be for everyone. And then I barely touched on the issue of sexual abuse. We know this is a problem. How are you not going to talk to kids about this? You think K through third grade don't get touched? Come on. We're living in a sad world with regard to that, but we can help kids be aware of things with age-appropriate instruction that can help diminish continued abuse. If DeSantis' former press secretary is right, it may be that more kids will grow up understanding themselves to be LGBTQ+. Yeah? That is a consequence. Okay. I'd like to hear how that's a problem that should limit my child's ability to get a good education. The second form of problem, this was all about the first. The second form of problem has to do with this parents' rights rather than the protection argument. Now, this is interesting, though. So people think, so in the announcement for today, there's this thing about banning books, and that is a big concern that I'm worried about. And parents do, want to sort of say, hey, we shouldn't be teaching this or that in certain schools. Look, I don't know very many teachers or parents who would want the anarchist cookbook to be taught in a class or in their school library. I happen to own a copy because I have to know what's in it if it's people are thinking it should be banned. So I have my own. Actually, I brought it to class. This was funny. I brought it to my class, and I shared it around because we were talking about it. You should see what we're talking about. So I handed out one copy passed around of the anarchist cookbook. And one student raised her hand, and I said, "Yeah," and she said, "Why is there a red flag on this page?" It's because I thought there was a pretty cool, crazy diagram, but she thought it was a little worrisome that I had flagged the page in the anarchist cookbook. I have no plans to attack anything other than bad arguments. Okay, so is it just conservative parents or people who want books banned who are concerned about books? No, there's also other people concerned about this. For instance, the frequent teaching of Huckleberry Finn, the Adventures of Tom Sawyer and Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, right? Which has gobs of uses of the N-word, right? There are parents who think, can't we find a book for common reading that maybe doesn't do that? That's not to ban a book, however. You can still have it in the library. It just means maybe it's not the book that everybody has to read. And is that such a troubling argument? I don't find that so troubling. That's not banning, however, but it is parental choice. It is parental voice. And by the way, people are listening, right? Folks think, oh, nobody listens. My kid's school begged more parents to get involved all the time. There's a parking spot that had for me on the day I participated in Watch Dogs, the dads of great students, right? They want more fathers to get involved because, they are more successful at getting mothers involved. Anyway, so my experience is that schools are happy, thrilled, desperate to have more parental involvement. They may not want you to sue at the expense of the district, but that's a different issue. So what are the dangers with regard to parental choice and the what I have so far called, yet not so much, well, only partly sort of explained as overreach of parent choice and the prioritization? When I say choice, I'm thinking about liberty in this context. Teachers may be lost more than they already are, and we're already hemorrhaging teachers. Students' freedom to question, think, pursue happiness is blocked for many. Problems of bullying and mental health are worse, not better. These bills are causes of more bullying. It's documented. We know this. Lawsuits can skyrocket. It's fiscally irresponsible to incentivize. Look, the Army used to provide medical care for everyone in the Army for free. They charged $1 and all of a sudden it plummeted, right? They know, why do we have to pay a copay? Well, sometimes having to pay a little bit significantly diminishes overuse, right? Why can't there be a small price? And by the way, we're also setting precedent. So this is part of the interesting thing to my mind, because lots of people want access to the courts. They want to be able to sue, but they can't, and they can't afford it. But if it's about their kids being taught things they don't want, they can sue for free. Well, what if we were to learn from DeSantis's lesson and maybe make hospitals pay for the lawsuits that people bring to them, and draw from this? Hey, it's precedent. I'm trying to build on DeSantis's argument. Let's make corporations have to pay for the lawsuits of their employees and so forth. This sounds absurd, of course, doesn't it? It's the same thing. In addition, if you want to think about freedom for parents to choose, think about the extreme. This is what philosophers do. We test reasoning by thinking about the absurd extension of the same reasoning. It's the same reasoning applied to this person. If it's okay here, you got to have a consistent principle, right? So argument ad absurdum, right? So what about the neo-Nazi parent who wants their kid to learn about Mein Kampf in class? I mean, learning about it is one thing, but it's another thing to be taught truth about the superiority of the white race, for instance. The Aryan race, I guess. Right? So the fact that the neo-Nazi parent wants a curriculum for their kids of a certain kind, well, they can have a voice, sure. I haven't heard of a school board meeting that's closed. I mean, personnel issues, privacy rights, medical rights, certain things have to have closed moments. But the rest of the meeting, you can come and you can watch videos on YouTube of crazy-ass school board meetings all the time with people who come up and say absurd things. There's some funny, like, college kids who sound like dudes, and they come and you know what I'm talking about back there. Right. So school board meetings are open. They want participation. Of course, it'd be nice if it were a little less crazy sometimes. But the idea of parents wanting something can't possibly mean therefore that they get it. But they should have a voice, and it should be considered. And if it's a good idea and it's a concern that we can easily respect, why not? Or with not too much difficulty, we could respect that. Freedom for whom? Right? Kids should have a say too. Parents should have a say. This is a subject for a different chapter of the book. I've written another essay that is another step of this overarching book that I'm talking about, in which it hinges upon what Dewey says about the three purposes of schools. The main ones are sort of what you might expect about kind of teaching kids stuff, right? But the third one, he says, the third purpose of a school, he says, is to enable the pupil to escape the limits of the local community in which they're born. He says he in the book, but I'm trying to update it, right? To escape the limitations of the local community into which he's born, says Dewey, is one of the three prime purposes of a school. And when you're talking about kids living in poverty, the parents will say, hell yes, I want my kid to escape poverty. If you're living in the ghetto, hell yeah, help my, these are terms that other people have, it's a quote, right? Like anyway, people in Appalachia I know want their kids to be able to get out of the rural, distant, poor place. No, I mean, Appalachia's great. I don't necessarily think that's for everybody. But some parents want that escape for their kids. They want options. They don't want to feel like they did, that they had no options and they're stuck in this place. Right? And I don't just mean physically or geographically. So that's the other thing. Parents want things for their kids. They should want the good for their kids, but part of the good for their kids is to escape the limits of their local community. So this is a mess that I'm trying to organize better, and I'm still working on it now. This is early. But these are some of the considerations for why I think it's really important to worry about the overreach of parents. Parents should have a voice. They should have some choice. They should have some consideration. They should have some respect. But not everything a parent wants obviously can be accommodated. And we've got to think very hard about the consequences for other people of your considerations for your kids. So how do we operationalize the character of the facts and meanings that we're talking about today? This is something that my colleagues, They want to hear operationalization, and I think that's good, and Dewey talks about that. I think that's great. So, for instance, how can we do that? How can we test our ideas? Well, I've mentioned a few things about this notion of different policy choices. Well, first of all, as I said, this is the weirdest thing in a country that thinks of itself as the laboratory of the states. Oh my gosh, I've gone way too long, I'm sorry. The country that thinks we're the laboratory of the states, how about we do experiments and allow different places to try different things rather than trying to push one kind of bill everywhere at once before we've even seen the results in the first state in which it was passed, right? Why not allow different school districts to try different efforts, and we can make opting out solutions, but at the same time, I do think we need to combat the limitation for those kids who really need protection, frankly, from their parents. I will say that while lots of people don't think it's there, the bill actually does include some of that. That if kids are under threat in their homes, actually that's one of the exceptions. So I think we don't have to be quite as worried about those kids in those cases. But I haven't time to cover more detail about that. I think the last point is that there's a lot we know from scientific inquiry about mental health, about sexual identity, about suicide, about bullying, and so forth. We need to draw not only on some person's individual common sense and discomfort that they don't know what pronoun to use, and instead think about maybe asking people and reading some of the literature, or at least you're a reasonable commentator who might be able to convey the science and understands it better than the layman, right? And can put it simply. So these are things I think scholars need to contribute, and this is why I think it's very important to promote and respect the rights of children and teachers so we get the teachers we need, and yet listen and try to think about how to help parents who feel frustration. Sorry I've gone too long, but this is obviously an important issue. I'm passionate about it, and thank you all for being here. And I look forward to your thoughts, comments, criticisms, and any challenges. Thank you very much.